So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker this evening. Richard Sargeant is the Chief Commercial Officer at Faculty, where he supports senior leaders across a variety of sectors to transform their businesses to make AI a reality. Before joining Faculty, he was Director of Digital and Data Transformation at the Home Office and a founding director of the UK's Government Digital Service. Before that, he worked at Google, the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, and co-founded Engineers Without Borders UK, and he's a non-exec director with the Government Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. So I think you'll agree he is amply qualified to be speaking to us this evening. And Richard, it's a privilege to have you here. So can I invite you, please, to welcome Richard to the stage. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Pete. I wasn't expecting such a lengthy introduction, but it is great to be with you. And I'm really looking forward to getting into the topic of artificial intelligence. I thought that we might particularly address two questions. So first, are robots going to take your jobs? Second, what has faith got to do with the future of work and AI? So Pete gave a little introduction about the things that I've been up to, but I thought we might start with what is AI? Could I just get a quick show of hands? Who is very comfortable that they know exactly what AI is? Quick show of hands? No. Half a hand. Very good. Okay, well, AI has been talked about a huge amount, but there is at least as much confusion as there is clarity. I like to think of AI as a calculator on steroids. It is something that is based around code, it is software, and it's very good at analysis, and it's increasingly good at taking inputs from cameras or microphones or other sensors to enable perception and the analysis of the data that comes in through those sensors for things like self-driving cars, for example. But AI is not the same as human intelligence. AI is really bad at common sense. There are questions that my 6-year-old can answer that AI will perhaps never be able to answer, like what's going on? No trouble for a human, but enormously difficult for artificial intelligence. So AI mostly works for very bounded, specific problems, where you have the data to decide what the right answer is, that there is some specificity and boundedness to the question. So something like chess, or in fact any board games, for the first time in, forever, really, a couple of 100,000 years, AI is now perhaps better than any person at any board game. And that's quite a significant development. One of the most complex, computationally complex board games, Go, was the subject of a big competition a couple of years ago that an artificial intelligence program that Google DeepMind created beat the world champion Lee Sedol. And it's something that within 30 years, I expect there won't be many games, whether physical or mental, where AI is not better than people. But that's okay. That is not a scary prospect. Computers have been beating people at chess for a couple of decades now, and yet more people are enjoying chess than ever, and they're using computers to improve their game, not just to replace their own pleasure. I think that Wikipedia will never stop our enjoyment of pub quizzes. Just because there are robots that can run faster than us doesn't stop our enjoyment of the Olympic Games. It's something where we don't need to be threatened. We're not in competition with artificial intelligence just because they are very good at some tasks. So I think the challenge, let me give a couple of other examples just to try and illustrate how AI is being used in the world today. And so many of you will use AI with voice assistants like Siri or Google on your phones, on your smartphones, but recommendation engines, whether you're buying products from a store like Amazon or John Lewis or Tesco's, the recommendation engines to predict what you're most likely to want is often using machine learning. Things like passport processing, back office operations, big processes that take in applications and try to assess what the risk of different people applying for passports might be, and then trying to automate the processing of the very low-risk applications so that you get your passport faster, that it costs the government less money, and that security is better. Those are the kind of applications that are in the world now, and that's the sort of thing that at faculty I do for a job. But how is AI going to change our work? Are robots actually going to take our job? Well, I think there's good news and there's bad news. So I'll give you the good news first. For tasks that are repetitive, that are predictable and analytical, I think that these can, to a large extent, be automated, but those tasks are usually a small component of our jobs. They are not the whole of what we do. They're often somewhat dull and nugatory tasks that we have to get done. So things like setting prices in a shop, or working out what a maintenance schedule should be for a fleet of trains, or constructing a staffing rota for a hospital. These are all parts of someone's job, but it's often the parts that are a bit of a pain in the neck, and AI can give people more time to do less calculation and more interesting and, I think, more human work. So I think that's good news, and I think that AI is going to be at the heart of some really big opportunities for society, not just productivity and wealth and sort of the bloodless statistics of GDP, but things that I think we might all care about, things like making personalized tuition much more accessible rather than just very high cost and elite. Things like being able to diagnose our own health much faster and without the need of always having to go to a hospital to do that. Self-driving cars, I think, will help to reduce congestion in London and other cities. They might also mean that we can buy houses more affordably if we can commute from further away at higher speeds. I think that AI might even help with climate change because of how good computers are at estimating and predicting things like how much energy we're going to need and what the right mix ought to be at any given moment. So I think there's lots of good news as far as AI and jobs go, and I think for most of you, this is likely to be something that is a tool, a complement. There is some bad news, or at least some more sobering news. I think that for jobs, and there are some jobs which are repetitious and predictable and more analytical, things like perhaps call center staffing or taxi driving, perhaps basic accounting audits and compliance functions, paralegal work. I think that AI may change some of those jobs more radically, and that is generally bad news. Generally, as people, we look on change with some degree of trepidation, and understandably so. But I think that where there are basic cognitive skills, machines will replace those, just as machines have tended to replace lots of manual labor jobs over time. So I think these jobs are likely to go or to change radically, but not all at once and not quickly. I think this is likely to be a pretty gradual change over our working lifetimes, and that is at least over the next 30 to 40 years. I think just like other general purpose technologies, the containerization of shipping, the mechanization of agriculture, the electrification of factories, these technologies were invented relatively quickly, but they take a generation to work through the economy and society, and a lot of the jobs that are made redundant or changed radically, people tend to retire and age out of those professions. So there's often very little harsh redundancy involved. That's not to say that this won't be a challenge, but I think it is a manageable one. I think that more often people and AI will work together, just as machines support physical labor now. And over the last century, the technologies that we have seen have generally been good things. They've been the driving force behind increasing standards of living, rising wages. I think the same will be true of AI. Looking back, there are very few technologies we might wish to uninvent, other than perhaps nuclear weapons, the selfie stick. But I think that the impact will be less predictable than we might assume from the hungry headlines that we read about robots taking all of the jobs. One example I viewed with interest was the introduction of ATMs. Cash machines were seen as the death knell for bank tellers. And bank tellers at that time were a relatively repetitious, predictable, analytical job, and you would have thought that a hole in the wall suddenly would have caused chaos and enormous unemployment. But actually, the employment of bank tellers rose steadily for the next 40 years after ATMs were introduced. Because the ATMs increased the efficiency of the banks, it allowed those staff to do other things that actually added much more value. Things like talking to customers, things like making loan assessments and helping people with mortgage applications. And so it's not going to be obvious what the impacts of AI are going to be, even on relatively narrowly defined jobs that might be seen as threatened by AI. I think that you might hear today that we don't need any more radiologists in hospitals because AI will do all of the diagnosis for us. But I don't think that's true. I think that we are likely to see a combination of people and machine. If you think particularly about medicine over the last 20 years with NHS efficiency drives, the amount of time that clinicians can spend with patients is often down to single minutes, 7 minutes for a GP appointment. So AI might be the catalyst for a more empathetic opportunity for clinicians not to just spend 7 minutes, half of it typing on a computer that doesn't really work for them and doesn't work for the patients either. So this might be an opportunity for a transformation of empathy and human connection, even as it might be brought by technology and machines. So I think that the impact will be less predictable, and we have always been fairly bad at predicting what jobs will come next. Certainly there are many fewer washers and agricultural labourers than there were 100 years ago when people were similarly anxious. Pete mentioned the Luddites and the Industrial Revolution, but we wouldn't necessarily have predicted many of the professions that now inhabit the modern economy, and I think perhaps we would find it equally hard to predict what our grandchildren will be doing for their work. But I think, lest you think me just another tech fanboy utopian in outlook, there are some things to be concerned about. There are some things, perhaps subtler risks that AI does present that are worth knowing about. We don't hear as much about these, but it's worth considering how we might prepare for them. I would choose 4. I think 1, there is an opacity at the moment to algorithms. It's quite hard to see where they're being used and what they're doing and for what purpose. And that can disguise selfishness. It can disguise the interests of firms that don't align with the interests of consumers. It can disguise the interests of governments that don't align with the interests of citizens. And so I think that that is an area where regulation might come. I think the second area would be that generally AI and machine learning increases the complexity of systems, and that can create fragility. Certainly in the supply chains that now span the globe, we see enormous efficiency, but also fragility. And the conversation around Brexit and Dover-Calais brought some of that into the headlines about 6 months ago. I think thirdly, technology tends psychologically to be given the benefit of the doubt. We tend I think as a people to say, if the computer says something, then it must be objectively right. And I think that tends to disguise the fact that the answers that AI gives often are informed by the data that it has been trained on. And there's been some conversation about things like parole judgments being made by machine learning, trained perhaps on a history of judgments that were themselves subject to bias and subjectivity rather than fairness. And lastly, we haven't always been good at managing labour market change when technologies have come around the corner. I think the deindustrialization of the North over the last quarter century of the 20th century left a scar that ached for a generation in those communities. And that's something that, while overall I'm optimistic about AI, is something we would have to actively manage. But overall as a country, more people are changing jobs every year than I think will be displaced by AI over the next 10 years. The amount of change in the labour market is enormous. We don't always feel it because we ourselves aren't necessarily changing jobs so frequently, but there is a huge amount of churn and dynamism within a modern economy, and I think that makes it relatively resilient and able to adapt to a technology like AI. So, what should we do to mitigate the transition that AI presents? So I think there are a few things that governments can do through public policy, things like funding retraining schemes for particularly affected professions, things like providing wage insurance or earned income tax credits. But I think that I want to focus on some things that we might be able to do ourselves, perhaps in our communities, and I'd pick two or three. Firstly, we have talked about lifelong learning for a long time, but it's never really become a reality. It tends to be a rhetorical nod to the fact that learning is important, but most of our learning is still done in the context of a community of school or universities rather than through our lives. For a bunch of reasons, but I think that we really do have to figure out ways of trying to address the fact that learning at the moment often stops when people finish school or university, and that is a handicap in the adaptation to rapid technological change. I think that often when we ask our children, what do you want to be when you grow up, we might choose to rephrase that question and say, what 5 things are you thinking of being when you grow up, rather than getting people just into the mindset that they'll do one thing for the rest of their careers. I think what we learn might need to change as well. The education system is understandably conservative about what we teach and how we teach it, but we perhaps have a legacy from a previous era of teaching knowledge rather than skills, and sometimes teaching quite narrow closed skills rather than much more open skills of critical thinking or politics or communication or analysis, things that are never going to go away for the lifetimes of us and our children. And I think lastly and most importantly, to help a transition to a world of AI, I think we need to be clearer about the differences between human intelligence and machine intelligence, rather than just eliding the two, rather than using a metaphor for a person as a machine. I think there was a sign on the control room of NASA that said, "In God we trust, all others bring data." And it's something that people often resort to in management. The adage that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it is often used, but I think that people have more to bring than data, and we need to make room for that in our workplaces. In 1986, in NASA, an engineer tried to get the launch of a space shuttle stopped, and he had a concern about the safety of some of the components. He had some photographs, he had a hunch, but he didn't have the data. And that launch went ahead, and the Challenger space shuttle exploded shortly after launch. I think that the way in which we manage our personal relationships, certainly the way my marriage runs, is not through data. It's through trust, it's through empathy, it's history and context and relationship, and all of those things are what make us human. And they're not things that AI is very good at. I think that it's what makes up a large part of the wonder of the world. And so ignoring it, trying to mechanize the world, I think is a mistake. So lastly, what has faith got to do with all of this? Well, I do work, but I am also a Christian, and I try to fit my work around my faith rather than just my faith into my working life. But sometimes the church isn't particularly optimistic about technology. I think the church may have predicted 10 out of the last 2 apocalypses that have happened. It's marginally better as a record than the number of recessions that economists have predicted over the last 20 years, but it's still not a reliable guide to the future. So I don't believe that the arrival of AI signals an impending apocalypse, but I do believe that Jesus was who he said he was. But as well as being true, I think that faith is useful in work as well as in broader life. And so I think particularly about 3 ways in which my own faith, I think, knits together with my work in useful ways. Firstly, it's taken me towards the idea of a vocation rather than just a career. It's something that perhaps is more designed to be in service to the people I work with, the people that I work for, citizens and customers, as well as perhaps to God. And I think careers tend to follow a logic of individualism that permeates a lot of modern society, whereas perhaps vocation and service might be a better route into lasting fulfillment. David Brooks, the author, wrote a little about this in his book, The Second Mountain, if anyone's interested. The second thing, I think that faith helps me to get beyond a measure of whether my life is making a difference or not, whether I'm changing the world. It's something I was particularly enthusiastic about, perhaps, as a student, but I think that faith has led me to an acceptance that first, we are human beings rather than human doings. It's something that perhaps in a frenetic life, in a frenetic city, we perhaps exclude the vitality of our inner lives and focus just on the outer life of friends and family and work and all of the busyness of the day. So I think that our inner lives through faith, a relationship with God, matters even more than the faint scratches that we can make on the consciousness of the world. And thirdly, I think that faith in work has helped me to achieve a sense of contentment, even when things are not going well, even when I've just flown back from the US and some conversations were great and some conversations were difficult. And anybody who has been involved with startup life knows that there are some high peaks and some deep troughs, but faith has helped to be something of a stabilizing influence to focus on and get some perspective. And so despite a lot of the trouble in the world that we read about, I don't think really is caused by whether it's AI or whether it's Brexit. I think that it's more to do with what's inside ourselves, but I think that faith helps us to internalize that we can't always have what we want, even if we can roughly get what we might need. I tend to think with faith that if it's not all right, then it's not the end. Everything will be all right in the end. So I think in conclusion, And those things aren't unique to faith, by the way. There's lots of people that have thought really hard about how work and life fit together, and they often come to the same conclusion and don't believe in God at all. But I think faith is enormously useful as scaffolding for helping us through our working lives. So to sum up, is a robot going to take your job? Probably not. I think that AI is more likely to be a blessing than a curse, but over the next couple of decades, we will notice its impact in almost everything that we do. I would be surprised if there were a person in this room whose lives would not be affected by AI over the next couple of decades. So there are some things that we should do: retraining, reskilling, considering how human intelligence might set us apart from what machines are good at, and perhaps through the lens of faith, we might also be able to resolve whether we're working in the best way. Vocation over career, being rather than doing, and confidence rather than anxiety and concern. So that's my view. Just a few reflections on AI and faith in work. But I think that there's time for Q&A. I'd love to hear your questions and to hear your answers as well. I had one question that perhaps if we take a break and you turn to your neighbour, you might want to ask if you don't think of anything else, which is what aspects of your neighbour's job that would they most like to automate using AI? What would you most like to get rid of from your current role using AI? So thank you for listening. It's great to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.